I cannot believe that I'm about to do May's wrap up. This year is flying by. I had a really great reading month. I somehow read, well, I have 9 books to talk about, so we'll just leave it at that. Some of them were very surprising. I did not expect to have, actually, you know what? Let me open my spreadsheet here so I can give you the stats. I hope I have them all in here, and I don't. Oh, Lord. Okay, let me just do this real quick. In May, I read a total of, actually, I read a total of 4,090 words, although I might have to subtract like 200 of those, and you'll see why in a minute. I read 5 fantasy books, 2 romance books, and 2 horror books. I had 1 5-star read, 1 4.5-star read, 2 4-star reads, a 3.5-star read, 2 3 stars, and 1 1-star, or DNF. So let's just get into it. And we will start, and we will go in the order that I read these books. The first 3 books are books that I read with a little experiment that I did, in which I read like Destiny Sidwell, who is another booktuber, and Destiny loves romance or romantasy. And if you watch me, you know I'm not a big romance reader. I do like it every now and again, just to change things up. Let's talk about those 3 books. The first one was Love and Other Words, and this is by Christina Lauren. This is my first Christina Lauren book. I know that she is pretty popular in the romance genre. This is actually my only 5-star read of the month. I loved this book, and I do find, or I've heard that some people found maybe the main character a little annoying at times, but whatever the case may be, it really worked for me. This is a soulmate trope, one true love, reunited, and it follows Macy and Elliot, who meet when they are very young and form this bond and this friendship and fall in love as kids. And something happens and they lose contact for like 11 years. And then they happen to run into each other one day, and Macy is engaged, and Elliot knows right away that he's meant to be with Macy. I'm not going to get too much into it, but I loved the vibes. This was a super sweet romance. The male character had this very tender and sweet attitude towards the female character. It is truly what the blurb on it says, a romance to make you believe in love again. It definitely deals with grief and death, and it has some hard triggering topics in it, so look those up if you're interested in reading this book, but I highly recommend it. I thought it was so well written, so sweet. I powered through this. I think I read it in 2 days, and it is 400 pages. Really, really good. Love and Other Words. The next book that I read was The 7-Year Slip. This is by Ashley Poston. I gave this book 3.5 stars. So this follows Clementine. And this is a romance book with a fantastic old twist, but I found that it was pretty predictable. I hated the trope that it relies on, which is the insta-love trope. At times, the dialogue in it, the banter, felt a little bit forced or inauthentic. It definitely got better as the book continued, I will say that. And I did grow to enjoy the relationship between the 2 main characters. There were certain aspects that the author included in here that honestly I don't really feel added much value to it, and I honestly didn't care about. and it detracted from the story from me. I wouldn't say it didn't have a lot of spice in it. So if that bothers you, there's not much. I would just say that the reason I didn't love this as much as I didn't feel as invested in the relationship between the characters. I thought that it was a little cringy at times. Would I read from this author again? Probably. I didn't hate it. It just wasn't my favorite. So, The 7-Year Slip. The next one I read was Powerless by Lauren Roberts. This is book 1 in a trilogy, I believe. And it is a romantasy. So it is fantasy, and it is almost a reimagined Hunger Games. Except the difference is that the players in this, they're not only the poor. So the characters in this story, they have magical powers, some kind of magical power. So while this felt very derivative at first of the Hunger Games, it definitely put its own spin on it and made it unique in its own way. I really enjoyed the 2 main characters. I thought that their banter was fantastic. I love, and this is so funny, but I love a cocky male main character, a male lead. I just do. I love that. And the female lead in this was also very strong, and she had a really strong voice and independence. Their chemistry was great. It really, I don't know. I really enjoyed it. And so while at first I was like, oh man, this is really like biting off the Hunger Games, I ended up loving it. And I think that the ending was great. I didn't see it coming. I did not predict that at all. And I definitely think that I will continue on in this series. So I think, I don't know if I mentioned, but I gave it 4 stars. And it's a bigger book. It's like 500 pages, give or take. The next book I read in a fantasy mood reading vlogs. I picked this up thinking that it was fantasy, and it ended up being more of a literary fiction. And so I think that because I expected fantasy and it gave me literary fiction, I didn't rate it maybe as high as I would have if I had gone into it knowing that it was a literary book. But I gave it 3 stars. So this follows Colette, and she is a vampire. And she has been a vampire for like 200 years or so. And this is a dual timeline. So you get the perspective of Colette in the present time, and also it goes back to when she's first turned into a vampire and follows her as she learns to navigate life as a vampire without much direction. It deals a lot with love and loss, death and destruction, her struggle to hold on to her humanity. She is a vampire who craves death. She constantly refers to the God of Endings, and I didn't mention, but this is called The God of Endings by Jacqueline Holland. She constantly talks about this power, this presence that kind of hovers over her, and she calls it the God of Endings. And whenever the God of Endings asserts itself, something comes to an end. She is, I feel like, constantly just living in fear and kind of running from this. I love the character work in this because you really get a deep dive perspective into this character. Although my main problem with it was the pacing, it was very, very slow. Not much happened, which is normal in literary fiction for it to be more character driven and less plot driven. But like I said, I went into this expecting a fantasy, and that's not really what I got. The prose in this is gorgeous. It's beautiful. Jacqueline Holland is a great writer. She, I think, does a great job inserting you in the setting with descriptive language. Overall, it needed just a little bit more to actually happen to hold on to my attention. I did find myself pretty bored a lot of the time. Would I recommend this book? I think that I would recommend this book if you like literary fiction. Stories that are very character driven, that just have the slightest hint of fantasy in them. It has a great message. It's a good book, and I'm glad that I read it. The next book I read was The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. I gave this book 3 stars. This book follows Luzia, who is a scullion or a maid in this household. And the wife in the household discovers that Luzia has magic. And the wife intends to use Luzia as her entryway into higher society. And she gets entered into this magical competition for the king. I feel like this book had a lot of great potential, but I feel like it just did not deliver. Leigh Bardugo does a great job at creating this atmospheric setting, at creating unique characters, and even the magic in this is very unique and beautiful. Luzia uses song and words of power to create magic. That is probably the best part of this book. The plot was pretty slow. I was expecting more. I was a little bit bored and found myself having to go back and reread things. I think that the subplot of romance was a little bit unbelievable and cringy. I did not love it. So the pacing needed some work. At the ending, I was really hoping for a grand finale. Yeah, it did not give that. The ending just fizzled out and was very lackluster. I was very disappointed in the ending. I think that this is probably my least favorite book by Leigh Bardugo, which is disappointing. But I will continue to read from her. I do think that she is a great writer, and I just think maybe this story just not her best. It happens. Next, I read Revival by Stephen King. I gave this book 4.5 stars. I loved this book. I think that King is a great character writer. So I think the strongest point in like all of his books is his character work. He really knows how to write characters that you can relate to and that are familiar. And I think that actually it adds to the sense of horror when horror happens in his books, because the things that are happening are everyday real life scenarios that he puts a horrific twist on. This book is much slower paced because it does focus on Jamie, our main character, who struggles with addiction, kind of points out the brutal irony in life and the unfairness in life. But it also talks about the things that we would do for the people that we love. King just really is great at dissecting the human psyche and what disturbs us and what scares us. And I think that he does this in grand fashion. The ending was dark and twisted in true King fashion. So I highly recommend this book if you enjoy that side of King. This is definitely one to pick up. And I feel like I don't hear a lot of people talking about this, but it was fantastic. The next book I read was Misery by Stephen King. And I gave this book 4 stars. So I've always heard tons of people talking about Misery and how it's one of their favorite Stephen King books and they love it so much. And so I had not ever read it. I had only seen the movie, which was years ago. So I decided to go ahead and pick this up. And man, boy, let me tell you, he delivers. It is so horrific. Some of the things that happened to our main character had me cringing, and man, ugh. So one of the things that I felt were prominent in the story is King's way of almost inserting himself as Paul, as the main character. He is this writer who has an accident and ends up in the hands of a fanatic. He kind of puts himself on the page in that as being such a prolific writer and having such a huge fan base, I imagine that there is no shortage of fans who are over the top and who maybe don't like the way he writes certain characters or certain books or I don't know, anything. But you can see in his mind he has dealt with similar worries and topics as what happens to this guy. Because the torturous things that happen to him are so brutal. They are so brutal, but they are plausible. And I think that is the key to the actual like violent and disturbing events that happen that are so utterly horrific. They're just horrific. Like the villain, Annie, is so real. Her character, I think what makes her so scary is the fact that she is could be a real person. Like the reality within her story, she's not some like supernatural being that is harder to fathom and to imagine. She's actually a person, and this could actually happen. Like the brutal nature of it really just makes you cringe. The fact that Misery, this book, this character that Paul has written, that Annie wants him to rewrite because she hates the way he ended her story. This book is like this looming presence within this story, and it represents the finality of the situation, like whether that's good or bad. When Misery's story comes to an end, Paul knows that in some fashion, his story is going to come to an end as well. This book is very suspenseful. I thought the pacing was great. It steadily climbs as you can see Annie's unhinged aspects and never knowing what's going to set her off. The setting is unbelievably well done. You're basically in one room or two rooms for like the whole entire book. Like you don't get much. It's not like he's on a journey. So what he was able to do with setting in this book is fantastic. Definitely recommend. Okay. Two more. This next one is The Lost War by Justin Lee Anderson. I DNF'd this book. I got halfway. So I got to like 224 pages and I decided to put it down. This is an epic fantasy, and at the start, I thought that it had a lot of potential. I really was intrigued by the characters. There are demons in this book and vampires, right? Was it vampires? Zombies. So I thought that it really had a lot of potential, but by the halfway point, I found myself annoyed because it felt like the author was changing the rules of the game as it was convenient for him in the storyline, which I cannot stand. I think that if you set rules in your story, that you should not be able to break them, that you need to adhere to them until the end. He definitely breaks that rule. So I definitely talked about that more in my vlog in which I read this book. So I'm not going to go into it too much, but that definitely bothered me. And the other thing that really bothered me was the lack of character development by the halfway point of the book. I felt that the characters were pretty stagnant. I do think that this book was very easy to read. It definitely felt like a beginner fantasy where all the concepts were easy to understand. The writing was easy to understand. I flew through the 224 pages that I did read. Just the fact that the characters felt like game pieces on a game board that the author was just pushing around to advance his plot really just didn't do it for me. So I will be putting this book on Pango Books along with book 2 because I have them both and I'm not going to read them. So yeah, unfortunate, but I did DNF The Lost War. And the last book that I read and I just finished last night was The Warrior Prophet by R. Scott Baker. This is book 2 in the Prince of Nothing series. I gave this book 3.5 stars. If you have seen my other videos, I gave the first book 5 stars. So I was pretty disappointed that this one didn't strike the same chord for me. It just felt a little bit flat. I felt like the pacing was off. It felt like it would ramp up and then slow down and then ramp up and then slow down. I did think the ending was compelling and definitely makes me want to continue in the series. Baker's character work is fantastic. He really knows how to weave their stories together and create these complex relationships. And he really explores the deeper aspects of our personalities and our beliefs. And he makes them very vivid and offbeat. So I very much enjoy that. He is a master also at writing setting and creating a world that is diverse and intriguing and just well developed. I mean, every aspect is well developed. You can see these towns, you can smell them, you can almost reach out and touch. He is really great at the details, the finer details. His prose is definitely on the advanced side. This did take longer for me to get through. He uses a lot of stronger vocabulary, and so to digest it, you really need to take your time with it and chew things over to get the most out of it. I do think that everything in the story, the plot and the pacing, was done with intention, and it needed to happen the way that it did, though it did leave me feeling a little bored at times, particularly in the first half of the book. At the halfway mark, it really does pick up the pace, although there are still some lag points that I found. But he's creating the scenarios with intention, and in order to do that, certain things needed to happen. And so it's done purposefully. And I understand it, but at times I still felt a little bored and a little like, okay, I need something more to happen. I need something else. So that's why I took points away from it. I'm glad that I read it. I'm glad that it's over. So that I can continue to book 3, because I've heard people say that the series is just so great. So I'm hoping that the next book really just puts it into full gear and delivers just more than this one did. That would be great. I've been talking for over 30 minutes, and that's everything that I read in May. I am planning on picking up some of the Spiffbo books this week from last year's competition, Spiffbo 9. So if you're not familiar with Spiffbo, I think that you should look it up. There's plenty of YouTube videos, and there is a blog that's run by Mark Lawrence, which he takes submissions from indie authors where they submit their books into this competition, and a panel of judges reads through them and they vote on them, and at the end of the year they determine a winner. It really highlights indie authors, self-published authors who are trying to get their work out there for readers to see, and there are a ton of great independent authors out there. I highly recommend that you check that out if you are a fantasy reader. And a lot of the books that are in these competitions can be found on Kindle Unlimited if you are a unlimited subscriber. So that's a bonus. I actually have 3 of them on my Kindle right now that I downloaded from Kindle Unlimited that I'm about to read. So I will talk more about them in the vlog that I'm doing or in my wrap up next month if you plan on watching. I would love to have you. I'm so glad you're here and that you watched this wrap up, and I would love to know what you've been reading. So drop me a comment down below, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching, guys.
I gave this book they determine a winter.